Christmas dinner was supposed to be warm, familiar, and comforting. The kind of night where laughter echoes through the house and memories are made without effort. My home was full that evening. 25 people filled the dining room, living room, even the hallway. Relatives I hadn't seen in years sat shoulder to shoulder, holding wine glasses, complimenting the food, smiling for photos. I had spent days preparing for this night, cooking until my feet ached, decorating every corner, wanting everything to feel perfect. My son Daniel arrived late with his wife and kids, barely acknowledging me as he walked past. I noticed it, but I ignored it. I always did. Dinner began, plates were passed around, conversations overlapped. I was sitting at the head of the table, watching everyone eat what I had made, telling myself this was worth it. Then Daniel stood up. At first, I thought he was about to make a toast. He cleared his throat loudly, drawing everyone's attention. The room slowly quieted. I looked up at him, expecting a smile. Instead, his face was tight, irritated. "I've had enough," he said sharply. A few people laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. "Enough of pretending everything is fine," he continued, his voice rising. "Enough of this fake hospitality." My heart started pounding. I could feel every eye in the room shift toward me. "You control everything," he said, pointing in my direction. "You make everything about you. This dinner, this house, this family, it's suffocating." A heavy silence fell over the room. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. "You embarrassed me my whole life," he snapped. "And now you want to play the perfect mother in front of everyone?" His words hit harder than I could process. I felt my face burn, my hands tremble. Someone whispered my name, but Daniel wasn't done. "You never listen. You never respect boundaries. You think cooking food gives you the right to control people." I looked around the table. Some guests stared at their plates. Others watched openly, frozen. His wife avoided my eyes. My grandchildren looked confused, scared. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to grow up like that?" he shouted. My chest tightened. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak. "Daniel," I finally whispered, "this isn't the time." That's when he slammed his hand on the table. Plates rattled. Glasses tipped. "It's always the time," he yelled. "I'm done protecting your feelings." The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. 25 people sat there as my son stripped years of pain, resentment, and blame down to its bones and laid it all at my feet. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to scream back. But all I could feel was shock, deep, paralyzing shock. I had given everything to my children. I had sacrificed careers, friendships, sleep, peace. And yet here I was being torn apart in my own home, at my own table on Christmas. I felt tears sting my eyes. But I refused to cry. Not in front of them. Not like this. Somewhere inside me, something shifted. A quiet realization formed beneath the humiliation and hurt. This wasn't just about dinner. This wasn't just about Christmas. This was about years of silence, expectations, and a role I had been forced to play. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment it finally broke. The silence after Daniel's outburst felt heavier than the shouting itself. No one spoke. No one moved. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second pounding against my chest like a reminder that this moment was real and irreversible. My sister cleared her throat as if she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Daniel stood there, breathing hard, his jaw clenched, eyes sharp with years of anger he had apparently rehearsed in his mind long before this night. I finally pushed my chair back and stood up, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. "If you're finished," I said quietly, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, "then please sit down." A few people gasped softly. Daniel laughed, a short, bitter sound. "See?" he said, looking around the room. "This is what I mean. You always try to control the room." I felt something inside me harden, not rage, but clarity. "No," I replied, meeting his eyes for the first time without fear. "I'm asking for basic respect. In my home." That word, home, seemed to strike something in him. His expression shifted, confusion mixing with anger. "Your home," he snapped. "You've always treated it like a stage where we all have to perform for you." His wife finally looked up, whispering his name, but he brushed her off. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some stood as if ready to leave. My grandchildren stared at me with wide eyes. And that hurt more than anything he had said. I took a slow breath. I cooked this dinner because I wanted us together, I said. Not to control anyone. Not to humiliate you. If you've been carrying pain, I wish you had told me privately. Daniel scoffed. You never listen in private. His words stung because deep down, I wondered if there was truth in them. Had I listened enough? Had I been so busy surviving, providing, holding everything together that I missed the cracks forming in my own son? The room felt unbearably warm. I noticed plates of food untouched now, the festive decorations suddenly looking absurd. This is Christmas, I said softly. If you want to talk, we can talk. But not like this. He shook his head. You don't get to decide how I heal, he said. And then, without another word, he grabbed his coat. His kids stood up confused, looking back and forth between us. His wife followed silently. The door slammed moments later, the sound echoing through the house like a final verdict. No one moved for several seconds. Then the murmurs began, soft, awkward, uncomfortable. Someone asked if I was okay. I nodded automatically, though I felt hollow. I excused myself and walked into the kitchen, closing the door behind me. The smell of roasted food, once comforting, now made my stomach churn. I leaned against the counter, finally allowing the tears to fall. Not loud sobs, just quiet, steady tears sliding down my face as I tried to understand how a moment meant for joy had turned into public humiliation. I replayed his words over and over. Some felt unfair. Others felt painfully close to the truth. That night, after the guests slowly left and the house grew quiet, I sat alone at the table, staring at the empty chairs. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided my entire life. What if loving everyone else had cost me my own voice? And more importantly, what if this wasn't the end of my relationship with my son, but the beginning of a very different one? The days after that Christmas dinner passed in a strange, heavy blur, as if time itself had slowed down to force me to sit with everything I had been avoiding for years. Daniel didn't call. He didn't text. Not even a short message to check if I was okay. At first, I told myself he just needed space, that anger cools with time, but as the silence stretched on, it began to feel less like space and more like abandonment. I woke up every morning expecting my phone to buzz, my heart jumping at every notification, only to feel that familiar drop of disappointment when it wasn't him. I replayed his words constantly, how confident he had sounded, how certain he was that I had wronged him. Late at night, lying awake in the dark, I began questioning my own memories. Had I really been that controlling? Had my way of caring felt like pressure to him? I remembered the years after his father died, how young Daniel had been, how scared I was of losing him too. I had worked long hours, come home exhausted, still forcing myself to be strong because I thought that was what a good mother did. Maybe strength to him had felt like distance. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums I hadn't opened in years, I found pictures of Daniel as a child, grinning with missing teeth, arms wrapped around my neck, eyes full of trust. I broke down holding those photos, realizing how far we had drifted from that version of us. It wasn't just about that dinner. It was about decades of unspoken resentment, misunderstandings layered on top of grief and expectation. A week later, my sister called, gently telling me that Daniel had been complaining for years, about feeling judged, about never being enough, about always feeling like he disappointed me no matter how hard he tried. Hearing that felt like being punched in the chest. I had never intended to make my son feel small. I had spent my life trying to protect him. Yet intention didn't erase impact. That realization changed something in me. Instead of waiting for him to come to me, I decided to write him a letter. Not a defensive one. Not an explanation. Just the truth. I told him I was sorry, not for setting boundaries, not for asking for respect, but for the times I hadn't listened, for the moments my fear had disguised itself as control. I admitted I didn't always know how to be gentle while surviving. I told him I loved him, not as a project to fix, but as a flawed human being who was still learning. I didn't ask him to forgive me. I didn't ask him to respond. I just asked him to read it when he was ready. Dropping that letter into the mailbox felt terrifying, like exposing a wound I had spent my entire life covering. Days passed, then weeks. Still no response. And yet something inside me had shifted. For the first time, I stopped shrinking myself to avoid conflict. I began asking what I needed, not just what everyone else expected from me. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I realized that motherhood doesn't end when your children grow up, but neither does your right to dignity. One evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, my phone finally buzzed. A message from Daniel. Just 4 words. I read your letter. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, unsure whether hope or heartbreak awaited me next. Whatever came after this, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about fixing the past. It was about whether we were both willing to face the truth and build something new from the ashes. After Daniel's message, the silence returned, but this time it felt different, heavier yet strangely calmer, as if something important had already been set in motion whether we spoke again or not. I didn't reply right away, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that rushing to fix things had always been part of the problem. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to sit with uncertainty instead of fighting it. Days passed, and I began noticing small changes in myself. I stopped replaying arguments in my head. I stopped rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. I focused on my routine, morning walks, cooking meals I actually enjoyed, reading books I had abandoned years ago because life always felt too busy. One afternoon, while walking past a small cafe I used to visit with Daniel when he was a teenager, memories flooded back so suddenly I had to stop. I remembered how he used to talk endlessly about his dreams, how I would nod while worrying quietly about bills and responsibilities. Back then, I thought worrying meant loving harder. Now I wondered how many times my fear had drowned out his voice. That night, Daniel called. Hearing his name light up my screen sent a shock through me I wasn't prepared for. When I answered, there was a long pause before either of us spoke, the kind of silence filled with everything we had never said. His voice, when he finally spoke, sounded tired, not angry. He told me he hadn't realized how much he had been carrying until he read my letter. He admitted that humiliating me at Christmas hadn't brought him relief, only guilt he didn't know how to face. I listened without interrupting, even when my chest tightened, even when I wanted to explain myself. When he finished, I thanked him for calling. Not forgiving, not fixing, just thanking. That seemed to surprise him. We talked for nearly an hour, carefully, like 2 people learning a new language. He confessed that he had always felt he needed to be perfect to earn my approval, and I confessed that I had mistaken independence for emotional distance. There were moments when neither of us knew what to say, but we didn't hang up. That alone felt like progress. After that call, nothing magically changed. There were still days of silence, still awkwardness, still unresolved pain. But something fragile had begun to form. Honesty without performance. A few weeks later, Daniel asked if we could meet for coffee. I arrived early, hands clenched around my cup, rehearsing nothing this time. When he walked in, he looked older somehow, like life had pressed down on him too. We didn't hug. We just sat and talked. About small things at first. The weather, work. Then slowly, the harder truths emerged. He told me he felt ashamed that his own children had witnessed that outburst. That hit me harder than anything else, because it meant he saw the ripple effects now. I told him I didn't want a perfect son, just an honest relationship. That sentence seemed to loosen something in him. As we parted, he hesitated, then said, "I don't know how to fix this yet, Mom, but I don't want to lose you." I went home with tears in my eyes, realizing healing doesn't arrive loudly. It comes quietly, in moments of mutual vulnerability. That night, I reflected on how close I had come to believing his cruelty defined my worth. I saw clearly now that my value was never dependent on how well I served others, or how quietly I endured disrespect. I had raised a son, survived loss, built a life, and I was allowed to demand respect, without apology. Whatever happened next, whether our relationship fully healed or not. I had already reclaimed something essential. My voice. And that, I realized, was the beginning of everything changing. After that coffee meeting, life didn't suddenly become gentle, but it became clearer, and clarity can be just as unsettling as pain. Daniel and I didn't start calling each other every day, and there were no dramatic apologies wrapped in perfect words. Instead, there was space, real space for reflection. And I learned quickly that space reveals truths people try hard to hide. I began noticing how often I had been the emotional shock absorber in my family, the one expected to stay calm, to smooth things over, to forgive quickly so everyone else could move on comfortably. Once I stopped doing that, even slightly, reactions followed. My daughter mentioned, almost casually, that Daniel seemed distant. A relative joked that I was finally standing up for myself. That joke stung because it carried years of truth disguised as humor. I realized then that my silence had trained everyone to believe I would always bend. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel brought the kids over unexpectedly. I wasn't prepared, not emotionally, not mentally, but I let them in. Watching him interact with his children, I saw both pride and fear in his eyes. He was trying to be patient, trying not to repeat patterns he was only beginning to understand. At one point, one of the kids raised their voice, and I watched Daniel freeze for a second before responding calmly. That moment told me everything. The cycle was visible now, and that made it breakable. Later, while the kids played in the backyard, Daniel admitted something quietly, almost like a confession. He said he had always believed strength meant never showing weakness, because that's what he thought I expected. Hearing that felt like someone pressing on an old bruise I didn't know existed. I told him the truth, that I had been strong because I had no other choice, not because I wanted him to carry that burden too. He nodded, eyes fixed on the ground, and for the first time, I felt like we were standing on the same side of the truth instead of across from it. That evening, after they left, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the echo of laughter and small footsteps. And I realized something quietly powerful. Reconciliation doesn't mean returning to the old version of love. It means building a new one with clearer edges. Over the following weeks, I practiced boundaries in small, deliberate ways. I didn't immediately answer late-night calls filled with complaints. I didn't rush to solve problems that weren't mine to fix. Each time I did this, guilt surfaced, but so did relief. Daniel noticed. He asked once if I was upset with him. I told him no, that I was learning how to be honest with myself. That honesty changed the tone of everything. Our conversations became slower, more thoughtful. There were still missteps. Old habits don't disappear quietly, they fight to survive. One argument flared over something trivial, a missed call, a misunderstood text, but this time, neither of us exploded. We paused. That pause felt revolutionary. During one particularly raw conversation, Daniel admitted that seeing me stop absorbing everyone's emotional weight forced him to confront his own behavior. He said it scared him, because it meant he couldn't hide behind stress or excuses anymore. I told him growth was rarely comfortable, but it was necessary if we wanted something healthier. Around that time, I started spending more time on myself, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of respect. I took a short trip alone, something I had postponed for years out of obligation. I enrolled in a local class, reconnected with friends I had unintentionally drifted away from. Each small decision reinforced a truth I had ignored too long. I was allowed to have a life that didn't revolve around being needed. When I returned from that trip, Daniel noticed the change immediately. He said I seemed lighter. I smiled and told him I felt stronger. Strength, I learned, doesn't come from enduring disrespect. It comes from choosing yourself without resentment. That realization didn't erase the pain of the past, but it reframed it. I stopped seeing myself as the victim of that Christmas dinner, and started seeing it as the moment everything finally became impossible to ignore. Sometimes, painful moments aren't meant to be healed quickly, they're meant to wake us up. And I was awake now, finally awake. The real test came sooner than I expected, because growth has a way of announcing itself when you're only halfway ready. It was another family gathering. Smaller than Christmas but heavy with unspoken tension. The kind where everyone smiles too much and listens too closely. I almost didn't go, not because I was afraid, but because I knew I would no longer be able to pretend. That night, Daniel arrived late, his shoulders tense, his jaw set in that familiar way that used to warn me a storm was coming. Only this time the storm didn't come from him, it came toward him. Someone made an offhand joke about overreacting moms. And laughter followed, casual and careless. I felt that old instinct rise inside me. The urge to deflect, to soften it, to protect everyone's comfort at the cost of my own. Instead, I stayed quiet. The silence felt louder than any argument I had ever been part of. Daniel noticed. He shifted in his seat, uneasy, glancing at me as if waiting for me to rescue the moment. I didn't. And in that pause, something changed. He cleared his throat and said, calmly but firmly, that maybe it wasn't a joke, that maybe people didn't realize how much damage words could do when repeated over years. The room froze. No one expected that, not from him. I watched his hands tremble slightly as he spoke, and I understood how hard that moment was for him. He was stepping out of the role he had learned, the one where dismissiveness passed as strength. The conversation moved on awkwardly, but the air never quite recovered. Later, outside under the dim porch light, Daniel admitted he had never stood up like that before. He said it felt like jumping without knowing where he would land. I told him that's what courage often feels like. On the drive home, neither of us spoke much, but the silence was different now. Less heavy, more thoughtful. Over the next few days, reactions trickled in. A relative texted me, saying things had felt tense lately. Another asked if everything was okay between Daniel and me. I realized then how deeply my role as the emotional buffer had been embedded in the family dynamic. Without it, everyone felt exposed. That realization brought sadness, but also relief. I was no longer willing to carry a weight that wasn't meant to be mine. Daniel, meanwhile, struggled in ways I hadn't anticipated. He called me one evening, voice low, and admitted he felt angry, at himself, at the past, at how much he hadn't seen. He said part of him wanted to blame someone else, anyone else, but that he knew that would only continue the cycle. I listened, not as a fixer, but as someone who finally understood that listening without absorbing is its own form of strength. We talked about patterns, how they're inherited quietly, how they disguise themselves as normal, until someone refuses to play along. He confessed that he had always feared becoming irrelevant, unheard, small, and that fear had shaped how he reacted under pressure. Hearing that didn't excuse the pain he caused, but it explained it. An explanation can be the bridge between resentment and understanding. Around that time, I received an unexpected apology, not from Daniel, but from someone else at that gathering. It was brief, awkward, and clearly uncomfortable, but it was real. They admitted they had relied on me being the calm one, and hadn't realized how much that cost me. I thanked them without minimizing my experience, and that felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't known was missing. Daniel noticed the shift in me more than anyone. He said my voice sounded steadier, my words more deliberate. I told him that when you stop doubting your right to speak, your voice naturally finds its footing. There were still moments when old habits tried to resurface. Times when he slipped into defensiveness, times when I felt the pull of guilt, but now we recognized them. Naming those moments took away their power. One evening, sitting across from each other with mugs of tea growing cold between us, Daniel said something that stayed with me. He said that seeing me choose myself forced him to confront who he wanted to be, not just as a son but as a man. That sentence held more weight than any apology ever could. It meant the cycle wasn't just paused, it was being examined. And in that examination, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Hope, not the naive kind that ignores reality, but the grounded kind that acknowledges pain and still believes in change. I went to bed that night understanding that healing isn't a straight line, and it isn't quiet. Sometimes it rearranges rooms, relationships, and expectations. And sometimes it asks you to stand still while everything around you adjusts. I was ready for that now, even if the final reckoning hadn't yet arrived. The confrontation I had been bracing for didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, which somehow made it heavier. It happened on an ordinary afternoon when Daniel came by unannounced, his face drawn, his movements hesitant, as if he were stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He sat at the kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had either been avoided or smothered under politeness, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said he had been thinking about Christmas, about that night, about the way he had raised his voice in front of everyone and how, in that moment, he had felt powerful and hollow at the same time. He admitted that part of him had expected me to shrink, to absorb the humiliation the way I always had, and that when I didn't, something inside him cracked. Hearing that hurt more than I expected, but it also confirmed what I had come to understand. My silence had been a collaborator in my own mistreatment. I told him that being yelled at in front of others didn't just embarrass me, it erased me, and that erasure had followed me for years, shaping how I moved through rooms, how I spoke, how I measured my worth. He looked down, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white, and said he hadn't realized how much of his identity was built on being the loudest voice in the room. He confessed that he had learned early on that dominance was mistaken for respect, and that weakness was punished or ignored. That belief, he said, had kept him armored but lonely. I listened, not to forgive too quickly, but to understand the full shape of the damage. I told him that accountability wasn't about guilt, it was about change, and change required discomfort. The air between us felt thick, charged with years of unsaid truths, and then he did something I hadn't prepared myself to witness. He apologized without conditions. No explanations attached, no, but you know how I am. No shifting of blame. Just a simple admission that he had crossed a line, and that it had cost him something real. The sincerity in his voice didn't erase the past, but it softened the sharpest edges of it. We talked for hours, circling around memories that now looked different under the light of honesty. He admitted that he had always feared being seen as insignificant, and that fear had turned him rigid, reactive, cruel when challenged. I shared how shrinking myself had felt safer than risking rejection, how being needed had seemed like proof of love, even when it came at the expense of dignity. At one point, Daniel asked what I needed from him now, and that question felt like the true turning point. I said I needed consistency, not grand gestures. I needed respect that didn't disappear when tempers flared. I needed him to understand that love without safety isn't love at all. He nodded slowly, as if committing the words to memory. The conversation didn't end with a neat resolution. There were tears, yes, but also long pauses, moments when the weight of what couldn't be undone pressed down on us both. Still, something fundamental shifted. When he left that evening, he hugged me, not the quick, obligatory kind, but the kind that lingers, uncertain but sincere. In the days that followed, the family dynamic continued to adjust. Some relatives remained distant, uncomfortable with the new boundaries, while others grew closer, drawn to the honesty they hadn't realized they were craving. Daniel began correcting himself in real time, catching harsh tones before they landed, asking instead of assuming. I noticed my own changes too. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, anticipating conflict. I spoke when something felt wrong, even if my voice trembled. And in doing so, I discovered that respect grows where clarity lives. One evening, Daniel called to tell me he had started therapy. He didn't say it for praise, only to be transparent. That call marked something profound. Not perfection, but effort. I understood then that reconciliation isn't a finish line, it's a practice. It demands vigilance, humility, and a willingness to keep choosing better, even when old patterns whisper their familiar promises. As I sat alone that night, reflecting on how far we had come and how far there still was to go, I realized that the terror I once felt at the thought of confrontation had been replaced by something steadier. I no longer feared being seen clearly. I feared only the cost of disappearing again. And that fear, finally, was one I was no longer willing to pay. The weeks after that conversation felt quieter, but not empty. They were filled with a different kind of sound, the sound of rebuilding. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There were no sudden transformations or perfect family dinners where everyone laughed effortlessly. Instead, there were small, meaningful moments that stitched something new together. Daniel started calling before visiting instead of assuming he could just drop by. When disagreements surfaced, his voice stayed level. And when it didn't, he caught himself and apologized without being prompted. The first time that happened, I had to step into the bathroom and steady myself because it felt unreal, like watching a long broken habit finally loosen its grip. Christmas eventually came around again, and I braced myself without even realizing I was doing it. My body remembering what my mind tried to forget. But this time was different. The dinner was smaller, intentionally so. There were no speeches, no forced cheer, no moments designed to impress outsiders. Just food, conversation, and a fragile but honest peace. At one point, Daniel raised his glass and thanked me. Not for the meal, not for hosting, but for staying when it would have been easier to disappear. His words weren't polished, but they were true, and that mattered more. I looked around the table and noticed how differently I was sitting. Upright, unguarded, present. I realized then that dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you stop surrendering. Later that night, as the house emptied and silence returned, I stood alone in the living room, surrounded by remnants of the evening, folded napkins, half-empty glasses, quiet proof that something had happened here, something real. I thought about the woman I had been years ago, the one who swallowed humiliation to keep the peace, who believed love meant endurance, who mistook usefulness for worth. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that survival isn't the same as living, and that being needed is not the same as being valued. But I also understood that she had done the best she could with what she knew then, and that compassion extended inward is just as necessary as the kind we offer others. In the months that followed, my relationship with Daniel continued to evolve. We weren't perfect, but we were honest. We spoke about expectations instead of letting resentment grow in the dark. When old habits tried to resurface, they were named, not ignored. That transparency became our safeguard. And something unexpected happened. I started reclaiming parts of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. I joined a local book group, began taking long walks without feeling guilty for leaving the house quiet, started saying no without rehearsing apologies. Each small act felt like laying another brick in a foundation that belonged to me. People often ask if forgiveness fixed everything, but that question misses the point. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain. It released me from being defined by it. It allowed me to move forward without dragging the weight of that Christmas dinner behind me. The truth is, families don't break in a single moment, and they don't heal in one either. Healing is uneven, sometimes uncomfortable, and often slow. But it is possible when truth is allowed to breathe. I no longer confuse silence with strength or endurance with love. I understand now that respect is not loud, and control is not leadership. Love, real love, makes room for dignity. As I sit here telling this story, I know there are people listening who recognize themselves in it. Maybe you've been shouted down, dismissed, made small in rooms where you should have felt safe. Maybe you've told yourself it wasn't worth speaking up, that keeping the peace mattered more than your pride. I want you to know something I learned too late but won't forget again. Your voice does not disrupt love. It reveals its absence or its depth. And choosing yourself is not betrayal. It is survival, it is growth. It is the beginning of a life that no longer asks permission to exist. That Christmas didn't end my family, but it ended my silence. And in doing so, it gave me something far more valuable than approval. It gave me myself.